So, hi, today I decided I'm going to have a video to try to catch up and pick up where I left off talking about the assignment where you're kind of the researcher setting up a study. This is one of my babies. This is Callie. She's a little feisty right now, so I thought she would be nice to be in the video as well, give you a chance to see her. I'm probably going to have to put her down so she doesn't scratch the heck out of me. But anyway, we're down in my hot office, so if I start sweating, you know why. All right, so I'll let her go. Maybe she'll come back when she thinks I'm not paying attention. Sometimes she will, but I thought we'll introduce Callie to you. All right, so I felt like this might be this assignment where you're basically acting like, and I'm talking about the project number 1 that's due by the end of this week. And I started off in the announcement where I did in fact, explain, trying to talk you through what we're doing here, which is basically you are setting up a study. And this first part, some people had questions about how to do the lit review, which is what we call that first part. A lot of times we sometimes just call it the introduction. If you're looking at your studies that you're reading, you'll see sometimes they label it as an introduction part of it. And I talked about how you're getting that original idea and then maybe coming up with a hypothesis. So I want to kind of pick up from there. I thought maybe talking will give you a different perspective and me just trying to write this all out for you. All right, so I'm going to use the example that I was doing there because it's real and I can kind of use my own experience with this to kind of show you what my students are doing. So again, just to recap, my students at one of my schools is we are studying the issue of loss and how that affects people, not just at the time, but even later. And one of the reasons we're focusing on later is because of sample issues. One of the things, any type of study we do in psychology, as you're just thinking about how to design one, you have to think about your sample. We want our sample to be generalizable. We want it to represent a bigger population of people. But at the same time, we don't have unlimited funds. And so a lot of times we use the most convenient sample we can, which typically happens to be can be college students. All right, so that's sort of where I'm at my school and what I've been doing. We've been using the college students who are right there as subjects in the studies. All right, so at the end of that last post or that announcement, I'd said, let's say I wanted to know, one of the things that I did want to know after doing some of this preliminary work was how loss in childhood potentially could affect academic performance years down the road. Is there any connection? All right, so one of the other things I'm going to bring into this is some of those discussions from the last announcement where I was trying to clarify some problems I've been finding in the assignment I'm grading this week, which is that project 2 milestone, where some people were still, it is a little confusing. The terms can mean different things sometimes, like in terms of design and variable and what those mean. So I'm going to use those terms too as I talk through this, as we talk about how you would set up a study for this assignment. All right, so let's say I come down with this question I want to look at. I'm trying to decide. I'm narrowing it down because in one study you want to narrow it as much as you can just because of practical considerations. If I have a study that's covering this huge broad thing, it's going to be a little tricky. So I want to bring it down, and I want to know whether or not students, for example, who have had a loss during their childhood, is there an effect on their academic performance? Where are they at as a college student? All right, and so the next step to this is to really identify what the variables are and how I'm going to what we call operationalize them. In other words, how am I going to make them specific? And especially when we're talking about the dependent variable, how do I make it measurable? All right, so thinking about this, and also this comes into play with the design. All right, can I do that study as a true experiment? True experiments are the ideal. And the reason that they are ideal is because in a true experiment, you can theoretically demonstrate cause and effect. All right. I have everything held constant. I do this with this group, and one group is different than the other. At the end of all of it, the only thing that would explain it is what I manipulated. All right. Unfortunately, a lot of times in this field, we can't do that. Here's an example. I can't do that with this study. If I want to know whether or not, having experienced a loss, especially I'm interested in traumatic losses as a kid, if I want to know if that influences their academic performance later in life, I can't manipulate that. Okay, I can't go out and get a bunch of young people and purposely, get rid of, cause them to have a traumatic loss and then see what happens to them. I mean, that not is not ethical, it's not practical, it's not legal, it's nothing. I can't do that. So in this case, I can't do an experiment. Okay. What I'm really going to be doing here is what we would call correlational design. I'm going to collect this data. I'm going to find out whether or not they've had a loss, and in this case, maybe I want to measure how traumatic it was, and then see if there's a relationship with their academic performance. All right. So those are my variables. In this case, you could argue the first part is my independent variable. What am I looking at is the determining factor here, which is the loss itself. Did they have a loss? Was it a trauma to them? And then my dependent variable is going to be measuring their academic performance. All right. When I talk about the word operationalizing, all right, let's get that down into specifics. How am I going to determine whether or not they had a loss, how traumatic it was, and how am I going to measure their academic performance? Now, there's lots of ways to do those things. My goal in designing a study is to come up with what I think is the best way to do it. Again, there is no perfect way to do it. There's options. Every researcher might do it a different way. Some of the reasons for doing it one way or another is just logistics and money and what would be the easiest way to do it. Sometimes it's also because maybe there really isn't. A lot of things that we measure in psychology are tough to measure, especially objectively. So how would I do it? So let's talk about both parts. The independent variable. All right, the first part of that may be fairly easy. I want to maybe identify, I want to know if you've had a loss or not. All right, I can ask. Maybe if I wanted to go back into records and look for it, I could maybe do that too, but that would take time consuming and maybe violating ethics. So I'm just going to ask people, okay? But the other part of this is what I'm really interested in is how traumatic it was, because I would have to be hypothesizing that maybe the more traumatic that loss was, the more likely it's going to affect them later on. All right, now how do I measure that? Okay, how do I measure and operationalize the level of trauma a loss gave them? All right, now I could do it some objective ways. I might think, and maybe from doing research, I might think, hey, it seems like losing a parent might be more traumatic than, say, losing their pet goldfish, okay? Or losing, a relative might be more traumatic than losing a distant friend or something. But again, I don't know if that's always the case. And having studied this for a long time, I don't know if that's true. I think there's other factors too. We could argue maybe the manner of death might make it more traumatic. Maybe if a child was present when the death occurred, or whether it was a violent or unexpected, might make it more traumatic. And in theory, that's true. However, it's not always true. Okay. So in this case, maybe the easiest way to measure it is to just ask the person, how traumatic do you feel it is? Now, granted, that is a biased answer. We've been talking about surveys, and people can mislead, they may misunderstand or whatever on a survey. However, in this case, I think that's okay, because what I'm really interested in here is not really the objective level of trauma, not what someone else thinks is traumatic, but what that student thinks is traumatic. So if they say, this particular loss was really a big deal to me, then, who am I to say, well, no, it shouldn't have been, or it couldn't have been, or it might not have been. I mean, if that's how they saw it, that's really what I want to know anyway. So that's what we did. So for this study, I operationalized the independent variable here, which is the level of trauma on a Likert scale. I talked about Likert scales in my announcement. So I had a scale of 1 to 7. 7 being extremely traumatic, and number 6 being somewhat, and down the line. And I asked them to rate it. Right. So here is, again, this is one of those scales, going back to some stuff we've talked about. this is really where that tricky line between ordinal and interval. It's really an ordinal scale because I'm asking them to rank. A 7 is going to be higher than a 6. Those numbers are not arbitrary. So if I say my trauma is a 6, then in theory that's more traumatic than if I said it was a 2. Okay, those are ordinal. Um, it's tough to say it's interval because I don't know if 6 and 7 is exactly the same as 7 and 5, or 7 and 6. Theoretically, maybe, but it's sort of a subjective measure. When we talk about it in terms of statistics, though, we typically use those numbers as quantitative numbers that are used as if they're interval, even though they really are ordinal. I know that sounds kind of confusing, but we're going to assume that the intervals are equal when we do stats. So this is a quantitative, part of that design. I'm using a quantitative method to measure trauma. Same thing with school performance. I think the easiest way to operationalize my dependent measure here, which is the school performance, is to use something like GPA, all right, which is a number. It's a quantitative piece of data. I can get it. I might be able to get permission to get it through the school, but I can also just ask people, hope they're telling me the truth, I guess. It's still a number, okay? So when we're talking about the main variables, that's the two we're talking about, all right? I'm doing a correlational design here, which means that when I get all this data, I'm going to be doing a correlational type statistics. I want to know whether there's a relationship between those. So if somebody says that the trauma is really high, does that correlate with a higher or lower GPA than it would if they maybe said that the trauma was lower? All right. Keeping in mind, this study cannot show cause and effect. Okay. It's possible. If I find, which is exactly what I did find doing this study, that the higher ratings of trauma were correlated with lower GPA. Now, does that mean the trauma caused them to go? Maybe. I can't say that, though. This just shows a relationship. It's possible there's another factor in there. For example, maybe one of the reasons that a loss was considered traumatic to that person was because it had other effects. They had to see a dead body, or they had to move, or they had other issues there. It changed their relationships with other people. And maybe those were the things that affected their GPA, not the death itself. I don't know. Okay. Correlations are still predictive. If I find a strong correlation, I can use that to predict. So if I find a new student that I'm working with who I can, a young person who's gone through a traumatic loss, I could say, well, geez, based on that study, I might predict that their GPA is going to be lower if we don't intervene and do something. But I don't know for sure it's because of the loss itself. It could be something attached to the loss. I don't know. Okay, but that's the disadvantage to not doing an experiment. But I can't do an experiment here, right? Also, one thing I want to clarify too here is this study, might seem like I'm doing a longitudinal study here, where I'm asking, okay, they had a loss back when they were younger, and I'm looking at their grades now but this is not really a longitudinal study. I'm just asking them, I'm correlating two variables. For this to be a longitudinal study, I would have to follow them over time. So maybe I measure their GPA now, and then I follow them into their life 10 years down the road, or 20 years, and I see what happens to them. All right, so this is that's what a longitudinal study is. I'm not doing that. I'm doing just a snapshot in time. I'm getting this information right now. Okay, so that's what we mean. Now, the other variables in terms that I want to just touch on here is how I can control other things. There's a lot of things here, like, for example, that might go into the trauma. First of all, there's variables in giving a survey and whether people are going to be honest or whether they're not. Their view of what I mean by trauma, if I don't define it, which I don't maybe want to, because I kind of want them to do where they want to with this. I might have other what we call extraneous variables that might be influencing my results. For example, what if my sample includes more men than women, or vice versa? Or maybe I have, maybe most of the losses are involving parents as opposed to other kinds of losses. So there might be things that are affecting the results. Now, how do I change that? Well, ideally, you want to keep these extraneous variables as minimal as possible. Ideally, you could find out all that information and make sure everything's balanced, and take a lot of time to set that up. In practice, we don't often have time to do it. One way we work around it is by randomly getting our sample, making our sample as generalizable as possible, getting a big sample, hoping that those factors will even themselves out. Do they? Maybe not. All right. But those are some other variables as we get through this. All right. So if I were going to do this study, just to finish this up here, I know it's getting a little lengthy, but thank you if you've stayed with me this far. All right. So let's say that's how I set it up. I'm going to do a correlational study. That's my design. I'm using quantitative data where I'm going to get their subjective measure of trauma. I'm going to correlate it or try to correlate it with their GPA. All right. That's my design. That's how I've operationalized the variables. That's my results. Let's say I get my results. I do a stat analysis. Luckily for you in this course, you don't have to do the stat analysis. That's a whole other thing. But let's say I do it and I find that there is a correlation here. All right. Now, let's say it is statistically significant, and for most of the time in social sciences, we're using a p-value, which is the significance value of 0.05. I know that's one of the things that's mentioned in some of the material here. Let me explain exactly what that means. What that means is if you set that at our p-value as less than 0.05, it means that the results that you got happening just randomly by chance is less than 5. And that's a risk we're taking. It's possible the results are wrong. It may fall in that category. Maybe I find a very strong correlation here. All right, but my P is less than 0.05. That means that the chance of me finding that correlation just as a fluke is less than 5%. All right. So that means 95% confidence that this is showing a real relationship. Still can't prove cause and effect, but I'm showing a correlation. However, keep in mind that you still have that chance, that 1 to 5% that it could be fluky. This is one reason why I've been telling some of you or all of you, please do not use the word prove in a social science study. There's always that chance that this is a fluke. It's always a chance that even if it isn't a fluke, that in an individual case, things could be different. Even if I find a really strong correlation, that does not mean that every single person in the world who goes through a traumatic loss is going to have an effect on their GPA. Okay, there's all these other variables to keep in mind. So in the social sciences, one of the things that always makes me cringe when I teach this, in a class is please don't use the word prove. Okay, even when a study, and sometimes even researchers are guilty of using it because they want to be right. They want to say that their findings are monumental. But prove is a pretty strong thing in the social sciences. We might really heavily support and we might show definite connections, but just prove without a doubt that this is causing this or this is related to this every single time, we're probably not going to get there. All right. So that's another thing to keep in mind. All right. Then we would go into, again, if we were writing this up, that's my results. If I found that correlation, then I'm going to have to, in the last part of a study, critique my own study. What does that mean? Okay, all right, so yeah, I found a correlation. That means that, as professionals in the field, for example, if I was a counselor or an educator, I need to be aware of that. I might need to know that a student who's gone through a traumatic loss potentially might have lowered academic performance down the road. So maybe I can do some things in between to intervene. Maybe if I'm aware of that connection, I could do things that might help. Maybe I get them a tutor, or maybe I watch their grades all along so it doesn't build up to this kind of an issue. So those are some of the implications. What are the limits of my study? Again, it's one study. I can't prove much of anything from that. It doesn't mean that every individual would be that way. Things I've already said. There's other limits too. Who are my sample? You can't force people to take your survey. So who answered my survey? What big, was it a big sample size? Was it just a few people? Were they mostly female? Were they mostly, one thing I find, again, doing this in a college, most of my respondents are social science majors. I don't know if that's relevant, but it could be. So, those are things that might limit. is GPA. I use GPA as a way of operationalizing my dependent measure. Is that a valid way of doing it? In other words, is GPA a good measure of academic standing? Uh, there are certainly some things to say yes, but then there's other issues too. What happens if somebody's in a major that's more demanding than another? So maybe they have a lower GPA, but it's just because they had to take really, really hard classes like organic chemistry or something. So that could be a factor. Maybe they had difficult professors over others. So those would be things I also want to talk about. These are, again, extraneous and confounding variables, things that could affect my results. They're confounding when they affect it one way or another. Extraneous are just all of these things that could affect a study. They're called confounds when, especially in an experiment, when those variables are affecting one group and not the other. So let's say, for example, I was going to do an experiment. I want to test this group of students versus this group of students, and it just so happens that the first group are all female, and the other group is all male. Now gender is a confound. Right? I don't know if the females do better, is that because of my experimental treatment I'm doing with them, or is it just because they're girls? Who knows? Right? All right. So for this assignment, to wrap this up, this is the kind of thing that you're going to be talking through and looking through. This is also relevant for this. You're evaluating the research study, which you started with the milestone, that milestone from week 6, where you were answering some of those questions about variables and about the way we are operationalizing things and the design. In the last big assignment you'll be doing next week, you will be analyzing that study in a lot more detail. And so I'm hoping that some of this stuff I've been sort of showing you, defining these terms, might make it a little bit clearer. All right. If not, again, this is a long video. I apologize for that. But, in a class, this is what I would spend a lecture hour talking about. Hopefully this helps you. If it doesn't, please email me so that I can help to make it clear. Please do not get frustrated with these assignments. To be honest, it is asking, I'm assuming a lot of you, this is a first research methods course. I don't set the assignments up. They're pre-made. This is challenging, especially if this is your first time doing this. So please do not get frustrated. Take it step by step. You might have to reread things. Keep in mind, we're not going into overly deep depth on the stats themselves. That will be in another course. So just do the best you can. All right. I understand that, for some of you, this is really, really a deep dive into something you haven't done before. And the studies they're giving you here are not easy. All right, they are very complex. They're not quite as simple with just a couple of variables like the ones I'm giving you here. But I feel like if I explain it to you with the simple example, maybe it'll help. All right, so let me know how it's going. Keep in touch. Don't get frustrated. All right, you're doing great. And I'm sorry, Kelly didn't make another appearance. She's kind of a little annoyed because I broke her up in a fight with her brother a little while ago, and she didn't like that, I don't think. She wanted to see that to its natural conclusion, but I did not, because I didn't want to deal with that. Anyway, have a good day. I hope you're keeping cool, and see you later.